Hey family, this is Trey with the Off Duty on Mission podcast. This is episode 3, titled The Weight We Carry from a Counselor's Perspective. This episode, we're going to look into trauma exposure, cumulative stress, anger, hypervigilance, sleep issues, maybe when to seek help, and some marriage train. So if you've been waiting on that episode to gently nudge your spouse or significant other, this may be it. If you've done the job any longer than a day or a shift, you understand that we have to suppress emotion to actually perform the job. Because if we let things get to us, then we tend to lose control of the situation. And calm is contagious, right? But so is losing it. That can make everybody go into chaos. But over time, we tend to train ourselves to remain calm. Why? Because we have to control the emergency scenes. But that often comes at the expense of our mental health. And even my opinion on the matter is, I believe we fear asking for help because it makes us look like we're soft. We've developed a shell that many believe is us being strong when we're silent, or we're just kind of standing there stone-faced like a robot. We also tend to fear the stigma around mental health. I'm one of those guys included. Even though I'm married to one, you're going to hear on this episode. Or maybe it's just the fact that we're scared if our agency finds out that we're seeking help, that they may create a mysterious file on us. That may not be the case. To do the job, we do have to learn to take care of our mental health, not just our physical health, but our mental health. So to kind of get the podcast going, and like I promised I'd do from the start when God laid this on my heart, we're going to look at the Bible because everything's going to be anchored back to that. And I do think even as mature Christians, I think we get a misunderstanding of what the Bible actually says about the topic. So the Bible doesn't just say seek advice and wisdom from God, but it actually says from our peers too. That's why it's very important to surround yourself with people that only make you better and hold you to a standard. But in the Bible, we'll go to Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. Bearing each other's burdens. The verse actually says, share each other's burdens, and in this way obey the law of Christ. Then over to Proverbs, where you get a whole book of life advice. Proverbs chapter 11:14. Without wise leadership, a nation falls. There is safety in having many advisors. That's speaking about wise counsel. Then Proverbs 15:22 speaks about seeking counsel for safety and success in life's struggles. The verse says, plans go wrong for lack of advice. Many advisors bring success. And then let's look at some of the characters in the Bible. And I know everyone's automatically thinking, you're going to talk about Job. There's absolutely no question when you read the book of Job, what Job went through. For this episode, we're going to go to 1 Kings chapter 19. We'll look at Elijah. So in chapter 19, Elijah was in a deep state of depression and despair. He actually had death threats on his life. So he was scared, paranoid, and just at a low point in his life. He was spiritually exhausted, he was physically depleted, and he was feeling alone. Sounds like a lot of us at times, right? He asked God to kill him as a result. Instead of condemning him, God provided for Elijah's immediate needs. So hopefully this sets the groundwork for the episode. I'm going to shut my mouth and we'll get into the interview. So go ahead and sit back, relax, put it on cruise control. Remember, hands-free device started February 28th. Anyway, let's get into it.
This episode is just for educational purposes. This does not imply a therapist-client relationship.
So who I have in front of me is Carrie Graham. She's a licensed professional counselor and licensed professional counselor supervisor in South Carolina and Georgia. She's also a telehealth provider in Florida, Vermont, and Idaho. She has been in the industry for over a decade. EMDR International Association certified EMDR therapist and approved consultant in training. She's had advanced training and consultation in the use of EMDR with traumatic brain injuries, somatic therapy, and eco state therapy. She also owns her own private group practice based out of South Carolina. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in counseling. So, hey, Carrie.
Hello. So happy to be here.
All right, so our first group of questions is going to be on trauma in the brain. So, what actually happens neurologically when someone sees trauma repeatedly?
Well, I think it's important to first to kind of define what trauma is. I think historically we have believed that trauma is just like these really bad things that happen, like fires and accidents and things like that. But what trauma actually is it's any event that seems like it was too much too soon, too little for too long, or too much for too long. So essentially, trauma is not about the actual event that occurs. Rather, it's about what happens in your nervous system in response to the event that occurs. So if we take that definition, trauma can be literally anything that our nervous system perceives as traumatic. So what happens in the brain? So we have three main brain structures that interact during trauma. We have the amygdala, we have the hippocampus, and then we have our prefrontal cortex. Our prefrontal cortex is kind of like our thinking brain. It's kind of like our CEO of the brain. This is the part of the brain that kind of makes our rational decisions, that helps kind of like talk us through, scary times. And then we have our amygdala, which is like our safety brain. It's our fight or flight brain. This is a part of the brain that gets flooded with emotions during a traumatic event that allows us to kind of implement our safety mechanisms, again, like fight or flight. And then we have our hippocampus, which is a part of the brain that's in charge of memory retrieval and then time and space organization. So during a traumatic event, chemicals flood the brain and the amygdala becomes overactivated. So this means that we're going into our survival brain. Also during this time, the hippocampus goes offline, and also the prefrontal cortex has lower activity. So what happens is we have a trauma response, and then our prefrontal cortex is not able to soothe ourselves and help us know that we're safe and that we're okay.
So, in other words, it's not just something, let's say, because I know I had a thought, or I guess that I assumed that any kind of trauma was only something that really affected you mentally. So, like one major incident, that I guess that shook you and then you couldn't shake it. So you're saying it's different. There can be a spectrum of things that can cause trauma.
Oh, yeah. And then what's traumatic for one person might not be traumatic for the next person. It all just depends on a lot of individual differences within the person. But, what's traumatic to one person doesn't necessarily have to be to another, and then vice versa.
So with that's also making the statement that trauma's trauma. So my trauma versus someone else's trauma, I guess there's I'm trying to find the right word. The situation, I guess, in our field is guys believe that their trauma is insignificant compared to somebody else's trauma. Let's say somebody else goes through a shooting and, it's a, I guess, national news thing, and then another person goes through a really bad vehicle chase or a house fire, or, just seeing somebody deceased for the first time. Or is their trauma any less significant than somebody else's?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, it's not like you think about our nervous system as being flooded with all of this information that feels like it's too much, and your nervous system's not thinking, oh, well, this isn't as scary as what happened to Joe last week, right? Our nervous system is just trying to respond and protect ourselves. And, we look at trauma essentially like if we were trying to like digest too much food, right? Like if we ate a really big meal and afterwards, if we ate too much too soon, then we might start to have symptoms like nausea or heartburn and things like that. And I describe trauma in the same way. It's an event that our nervous system doesn't have the capacity to process all at one time. So then we're going to notice symptoms. And for each person, that might be a different level of the situation.
So moving on into hypervigilance, and we hear the word a lot, and the simplest way that I can put it is, and how I'll describe to people, is place yourself, in a new situation. Let's say, you walk into a new store, or it's even funny. I use the illustration of, when you get in a new area of town, you turn the music down, essentially, because you're kind of overstimulated. A lot of things are coming in, but your senses are more aware because you're not in a comfort zone. So for someone that doesn't experience hypervigilance, for law enforcement, firefighters, dispatch, even in the hospitals, you're at a heightened state of awareness to kind of help yourself survive, just meaning that, your spidey senses are kind of tingling all the time. So with that, how can first responders lessen that impact once they get home of that all day long?
Yeah. Well, I did want to acknowledge, too, that hypervigilance while you're at work is a good thing because it keeps you safe. It's your brain trying to predict any dangers that could come up and kind of preemptively protect you from that. So hypervigilance is a very good thing whenever we're at work. Hypervigilance isn't such a great thing when we're at home and we're safe and we're with our family, because then we're just kind of left in this sympathetic arousal state, which is our fight or flight, which can increase things like irritability and anger and frustration. So while it's really helpful on the job, it's not so helpful at home.
We'll get into it here in a little bit. Episode 2, I talked about transition rituals, and that's kind of later down in the show. But why do certain calls tend to stick in our brains above other calls?
Well, I think that just depends on a number of factors. But if you think about, each individual differences, we're all kind of bringing in ourselves into every call, right? Or you guys are bringing yourselves into every call. And that really just depends on your history and what's important to you. I know that you've shared some with how sometimes calls with kids and things like that can be more impactful because, you have kids, or, if you've had previous negative experiences that are kind of cumulative, then these calls kind of are like the straw that broke the camel's back, for instance. And also kind of depends on what you're bringing into the day, right? Like if you are sick, or if you didn't sleep well, or you had an argument with your spouse that day, right? You're already in that kind of hypervigilant state. And so that just affects how your nervous system is going to be able to process that memory. Kind of your baseline is going to determine how much you can process. And so sometimes those calls are going to be harder than others, just depending on what you're bringing into the day.
Yeah, so I know most the calls that stick out in my mind do involve kids. And even before I had kids, it was something that, just kind of resonated to me more than anything else. And
which that also reminds me too, when I think about, these calls being more impactful than the other. This is also a good time to kind of bring up how mental health treatment doesn't have to be responsive necessarily. It can also be preventative, right? So if you are seeking services and taking care of mental health prior, it might be able to increase your capacity to deal with some of these things.
We also hear a lot about compartmentalization. Is that actually dangerous? Because I know a lot of people, the thought in our industry is compartmentalization is dangerous and you don't want to do it, and it's going to end up boiling over, and you're going to lose it in so many years or whatever. How about it, go into that just for a second?
So yes and no. So first responders compartmentalize because they have to, right? Like your nervous system and your brain and your body is not going to be able just to carry around like all the loads of all of the calls that you've responded to, in the week or the month, right? So to some degree, you have to compartmentalize, especially when you're going on shift and you have to, respond to more calls. So compartmentalizing is a safety mechanism that your brain does in order to help you allow you to continue doing the work. The problem comes whenever we just leave it there and we never address it, right? So if we kind of stuff it in this box and put it in the back of the closet and hope it never comes out, eventually we're going to have to clean out that closet, right? or else it can start to build up. You can start to have somatic symptoms, body pains, trauma symptoms, and we're not even sure where it's coming from, but it's coming from that box in the back of the closet.
When it comes to stress, so and also another thing that may be kind of misconstrued is when it comes to stress. So is there a form of healthy stress?
Well, yeah. Our bodies are created to respond to threats, right? So if we look at kind of like our baseline nervous system, we're in what we call a ventral vagal state. This is from polyvagal theory. And in our ventral vagal state, we're calm, we're grounded, we're connected, we can interact with our friends and family, right? But if our body perceives something as being a threat, then we're going to go into that sympathetic arousal, which is our fight or flight. And that's a good thing, right? Like if there was a cheetah lurking in the woods, right, we're going to want a little bit of that stress. We're going to want a little bit of that activation so we can try to fight or flight that threat. So there's an amount of good, healthy threats. The problem is when we get stuck in that, right? If we don't have the time or the space to kind of recover from these threat responses, we can essentially get stuck in those states. But we do need that stress to protect ourselves.
When it comes to post-traumatic stress disorder, we hear that a lot, and sometimes it's more of a stay away from that, or it's always going to lead to post-traumatic stress.
So trauma memories are stored in the brain different than our normal memories. So trauma memories are essentially stored as emotionally charged, fragmented pieces of information that are stored primarily in the amygdala. So what this means is that we don't have this nice, coherent, long-term memory that we can recall whenever we choose to recall it. Instead, this is a memory that is kind of floating around in the brain in kind of fragmented pieces. So that means if you see a visual or smell or some kind of stimulus that reminds the brain somewhat of that memory, then all of that sensory information from that memory is going to come flooding forward. Right. And the brain's trying to do that because it's trying to predict. It's trying to say, okay, this stimulus kind of reminds me of this bad thing that happened. We need to go back into our safety, our fight or flight, or our dorsal vagal shutdown, or whatever that nervous system response is, because your brain assumes that the same bad thing is going to happen again. So with post-traumatic stress disorder, essentially what we have is we have these fragmented pieces of information that's stored from this trauma memory that we're going to start having all of these symptoms that the brain doesn't know that bad thing happened, 5 months ago, 6 months ago, 10 years ago. It feels like it's happening right now. So you can imagine that could be, problematic if you are, with your family and you hear, your kids crying or something like that. And that is a part of that fragmented memory. Your body's going to go into that same response that you had at the time of the trauma. And that's when you start to see those PTSD type symptoms of hypervigilance and anxiety and negative thoughts and sleep issues and flashbacks and nightmares and all those different things that start to come up.
So it's funny you brought that up. Well, it's not funny because it's one of my biggest issues, and I wish I could get over it, but I know you experience it, and I've said it to you before, but even when the kids were born, and even now, I cannot control my reactions when they scream, when they cry, when they yell, because it actually makes me panic. And I've explained that to you before, that it's a scary situation for me, but it's only because, and I'm not using it as an excuse, but it goes back to hearing, a child cry, or and that kind of stuff, and the child was experiencing immense pain, and it goes back to that and triggers that memory every time I hear our kids cry, and it's kind of hard to describe, but
that maladaptively stored trauma memory.
Yeah. So I definitely still deal with that, and just because I'm doing a podcast on this, or even and it's funny because a lot of people have joked about, well, you're married to a counselor. Yeah, well, you're not my counselor. And
absolutely not.
Yeah, so I deal with things like that, and I'm human too. So the little things can come back. And I'm not saying I have PTSD or anything like that, but I'm saying that I definitely deal with that with my kids when they cry. Something in me just panics, and it's hard to actually calm down. And I know you've seen that. It's kind of been frustrating in the past because I got to leave or walk out or just, yeah, it kind of triggers me. But when it comes to first responders, why do first responders tend to struggle with turning it off? I guess turning the job off.
Yeah, because it's such a brain thing, right? Like I mentioned before, our brain is constantly trying to predict and protect us. That's the job of that amygdala, that survival part of our brain. So that part of your brain is, I kind of joke around with it. It's not super smart, and then it doesn't know that you're home now, right? Like that part of your brain's not like, I'm home, everything's okay. That part of your brain is constantly scanning. So we have to do some tricks and techniques to kind of try to convince the brain that, hey, we're home, the threat's over, we can relax a little bit.
So I used to tell the guys in training that, I stayed at a Holiday Inn last night when I talked about these things. Or, of course, I would always bring you into the equation. And anyone listening that ever listened to me in training, they'll probably smirk at it. But I always said, hey, the things I say in front of you guys, I've run by you as my wife and the expert on it before I open my mouth in front of people. But I've explained the amygdala to people as far as, just like you said, there's no thought process. It's just a reaction, right? So when your brain is in that state of fight or flight, like there's no, like you can train, and we call it stress inoculation. You can train with stress inoculation, which is just putting yourself in situations to learn how you're going to react to something, either being, a stress induced course where you have to run, push-ups, shoot, or, you have to shoot a certain group within a certain amount of time. If you miss, you're going to do 100 burpees or whatever. So that's the only kind and then of course adding time to our shooting courses is really the only way we can induce stress without actually being shot at.
Well, yeah, if you remember too, like in that stress response, what we're having is that overactive amygdala, which is the fight or flight. We have an underactive hippocampus, which is your time and space, the one that says, hey, this is happening in 2026 and it's here and it's now. And that prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that is able to kind of speak to your amygdala and say, speak those rational things that we're safe, we're okay now. And so if we're having overactive amygdala and underactive hippocampus and frontal lobe, your brain doesn't know the difference.
Yeah, so when we're getting into it, and since we're kind of hovering over emotions, so anger seems to be, at least is one of my, I wouldn't say anger. I don't really get angry. I get grumpy and irritable. And it is what it is. But I don't ever get angry. But is that always a character flaw when it comes to, I guess, mental health and first responders? Or is it a character flaw, or is it unprocessed trauma, or is it both?
Yeah, I mean, it's typically never a character flaw. I mean, most of the time, our responses in the present moment are because of the past experiences that we've had, or a nervous system response, right? So a part of that fight or flight response is the fight part. And that fight part, brings up irritability, frustration, anger, right? So if that is kind of the state of your nervous system, that's what you're going to see. You're going to see that anger, not because you're a bad person or that they're a bad person. It's just because that's what the nervous system thinks that it has to do to protect itself.
So with that, how is there a safe way to reverse it? And I know you can throw in maybe counseling, but I know I have maybe hobbies, and I know you get mad at me because my hobbies changed a lot, I guess.
Well, definitely a shameless plug for therapy, and particularly like trauma-focused therapies would be really helpful. But other kind of like practical day-to-day things that you could do is that you could try to get your nervous system to understand that the threat is over. So that could look like a number of things. It could be, exercising. It could be listening to your favorite song. I know dancing. I don't really see a lot of first responders dancing, but it is a really proven way to kind of get back into that calm ventral vagal state, which is, really important.
I'm not dancing.
You can dance. We can dance together.
No.
Okay. And then other ways that we can do it is through like mindfulness. So again, the trick is that nervous system needs to know that the threat is over. We're home. So a simple way that you can do that is using all 5 of your senses when you enter into your home or your space or wherever you are after work. Take a moment just to kind of scan the room with your eyes, kind of take in all the visuals, take in your favorite pictures on the wall. You can notice the smells of any like candles or incense or whatever your house smells like. You can listen to sounds. You can listen to, you can just kind of feel what your favorite like blanket feels like or something like that. You want to use all 5 of your senses to kind of convince your nervous system that the threat is over, right? And it typically responds pretty well to that.
And I noticed you didn't say anything about running right in and drinking alcohol.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah, no. or coming in and, going to some kind of substance or, I guess coming in and going straight to your phone. I know I'm guilty of it. Or, I guess going in and isolating yourself from your family. All these things included, like you said, all your 5 senses to try to transition your brain from work mode to home mode. If you're a spouse or your spouse is not listening, you may want to mark the timestamp now. Or you may want to hit pause and go get them because we're going to get into some family. Secondary trauma is kind of the spill off onto your spouse and your kids. So as a counselor, what do you see? And I guess the illustration is like our kids. I can see our kids are younger, so they don't really communicate the way as we would, being like, hey, I feel this way because they just know that something's different. So they may act out, either crying or maybe grumpy, pouty face like both of them do. So when it comes to secondary trauma, how does that affect the kids and the spouse?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you think about, being a spouse of a first responder, you're going to have a lot of those same trauma symptoms as they will, especially for particularly difficult calls. If you hear or learn about an experience that they have, you might go through that same nervous system response that they do, that same anxiety, that same fear, that same shutdown response. And that's a really common thing that you're going to notice. And like you said with the kids, I mean, I think, we see it a lot with our kids. We kind of set the temperature for our kids, right? Like, so if we're coming in and our nervous system is all kind of jacked up and heightened, it's going to reflect on them. They perceive that. Right. And so then it starts to look like they're acting out or they're being, difficult. But what they're doing is their little nervous systems are mimicking what ours are doing.
Yeah. And so we're not, and I know some of the people that know the episodes and everything. So we're going to do a separate episode on marriage. So these answers and questions that we're doing on this now are more of a clinical part of what's going on. So it'll be hopefully funny and not concerning when we actually do our marriage spouse episode, and we'll kind of talk more about our stuff. But I will I'll go into the part of, I guess, us that applies to this is when we first got married, you would tend to text, and if I didn't respond within 30 seconds or 2 minutes, there were 5 phone calls.
Maybe 5 minutes.
Yeah, 5 phone calls missed. I even think I got a phone call from dispatch and about, hey, your wife wants you to call you. So as far as a spouse is concerned and that secondary trauma, explain what's going on in your head. And this is also for the first responders that may not understand that their spouse is going through all this, because the spouse, I guess, wants to remain strong and doesn't want to say, well, I'm having issues with this too. So what's your take on that?
Well, I think a lot of the times, like, you wouldn't tell me about a lot of like the really scary calls and things like that. But like sometimes, like, I would know about them. So essentially, once you know about these really scary things that are happening, right, you're almost having a very similar response. So yeah, if I would text him or text you, and I wouldn't get a response, my mind would automatically go to, okay, he's he's in the hospital, like something bad's happened to him. I'd even like text or call some of the wives I know that would be on shift and kind of checking in and checking the news stations and just seeing, making sure there's nothing going on, or the CAD or something like that, because we start to go into that fight or flight mode too,
Yeah. So that also goes down, and when we get into our marriage episode, we'll go into it a little bit more, but there was a situation in 2018, and I still feel bad to this day because I actually left my cell phone in my car, and it was the shooting that made national news here locally, and the president even made comments on it where the 7 officers were shot. And I remember you telling me you just felt something, and then you couldn't get a hold of me, and then you saw the news, and I think it was roughly 2 hours, because I left my cell phone in the car.
I think it was more than that. All we heard was like, officer down, and we didn't know who or what. Yeah.
Yeah. So I actually had to find a radio once it was over, and I made contact with the instant commander, who in turn, and I could not remember your cell phone number.
Called me at work.
Yeah, guys, if I can tell, guys, gals in first responding, please, if you don't remember any other number, remember your spouse's number, because, you save it to your phone. You don't ever think I need to remember a number. I could not.
Or when you're in a trauma situation,
Yeah,
you don't have access to that, that working memory.
Absolutely. I could not for the life of me remember her phone number, because there were other guys back there that had cell phones, but I could not remember her number. So I actually ended up using a radio to contact someone, and I could only remember where she worked. So that's why I remember telling, hey.
We were married at this point, too.
Yeah. So I said, hey, can you guys call this place and tell my wife that I'm okay on the radio? As far as a spouse, when it comes to counseling, so what if your significant other doesn't want to go to counseling and you think that counseling may be good? What could you do as a spouse to maybe help encourage or to settle stigmas of counseling?
Yeah, I mean, I think just having a lot of good conversations. I think that's probably things I've done with you too, or just giving just some education about how, counseling, it's for everybody. It's preventative. We need to take care of our mental health just like we would take care of our physical bodies. I would hope that if we were sick, we would go to the doctor at some point, right? This is the same thing. If we're not feeling well mentally, we want to be comfortable enough to go see somebody about that. And another thing you could do is, look up different resources, maybe kind of provide some options, or look up, there's tons of therapists that specialize in working with first responders. Typically, the first responder spouses are going to respond better to that, because then they feel like this is somebody who kind of understands and that gets them. I'd be happy to also kind of help point anybody in the right direction of finding those resources.
Yeah, at the end of the episode, we'll get your information, how people can get in touch with you, or maybe one of your clinicians, or someone that, even if it's not you or anyone that works for you, it can be someone that you recommend. So getting into that, the last part of the episode, and I kind of want to break it down just a few minutes. We hear of EMDR a lot in the field, and it's kind of voodoo is what I call it. And I know you don't call it voodoo, but I call it voodoo because
not voodoo.
I, as a first responder, I went through an incident. It's been 10 years now, and it was before we met, and I went through an incident, and it actually wasn't even work related. It was involving my mom, and I got a phone call one morning that my mother had gone to the hospital, and it wasn't a concerning phone call. It was just, hey, I need you to come to the hospital. Your mom's in the hospital. So I got dressed, went to the hospital, and me being a cop, you go in the back door of the emergency room, and this was the old McLeod emergency room, not the new one. But you go in the back door, then you go look up on the screen, get the room number, get the name, and just go to the room, because you don't want to mess with anyone. You don't want to bother anyone on the floor. And so that's what I did. I went, saw my mom's name, went to the room, peeled back the curtain, and the first thing I saw was my mom laying on the table with cables and all the leads coming off of her, and she was actually dead. And that was very unexpected. So that kind of sent me into a downward spiral. Work, I was getting real irritable at work, so I approached a peer at my job through the agency. They offer a resource that, and everyone at my agency knows, because every time we go to in-service, we see, it's always offered. And we may talk about it in another episode, but I don't have permission to talk about it. But anyway, I reached out, so I got to go to a session of EMDR, and what happened, it's kind of like the horizontal gaze nystagmus. For anyone that's done field sobriety, they put a little stimulus in front of your face, you think of a bad thought, for a little while, you dwell on it, you look at the stimulus, move, and then you think of a good thought. And now, once I had that done, anytime I relive the situation with my mother, that I cannot associate anything negative with it. And it's kind of weird, to experience that, but it's also incredible now that even 10 years later, I still cannot associate anything bad with that. So kind of go into EMDR and what it is from your perspective, because I can't really describe it.
Yeah, so EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And what we're doing is it's a specific type of therapy where we are going to go in and reprocess and desensitize those memories that are maladaptively stored. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to go in and kind of find out what are the memories that are maladaptively stored? What are the ones that are coming up that are triggering us in the present day? And we are going to use that bilateral stimulation to activate the parts of the brain that are needed to reprocess a memory. Lots of really cool brain science things happen during that reprocessing. But EMDR kind of follows three main principles. And what that is that the past is in the present, right? And that current distress and current triggers are from maladaptively stored memories from the past. And the third, and probably my most favorite part about it, is that the brain has a natural ability to heal itself. So essentially what we're doing is we are taking that old memory that was too much for our nervous system to process at the time, and we're going to reactivate it through the different stages and phases of EMDR. And once it's reactivated, we're going to use that bilateral stimulation and the natural healing properties of the brain to naturally move that memory from a maladaptively stored memory to a long-term memory that we can recall, right? We remember it, but it doesn't cause us that visceral response that it once did.
Yeah, that's kind of hard to put it into words when you experience it, but I'm telling you, it's definitely worth it to look into. So what would you tell someone, because it is a little, I wouldn't say scary, but it is different. It's not necessarily talking to someone, but what would you tell someone that may be scared of it or the process of it?
Yeah, I would say make sure that you find somebody who is trained and or certified in EMDR. And what they're going to do is they're going to safely bring you through this, right? We don't just jump in and start, processing the first and the worst thing that's ever happened to you, because that would be really overwhelming and probably scare tons of people away. Rather, it is a phased approach where we start with phase one, where we're going to find out what are those memories. Phase two, we're going to be doing a lot of preparation and skill building and making sure that you're ready to do this work. And then we start doing the reprocessing. And depending on the person, I might start with the least most distressing memory that they've experienced rather than like the worst one that's ever happened, just to kind of get your feet wet and kind of get you used to the process.
So in closing, how would someone get in touch with you? And like I said, this isn't something where someone can come and, maybe they're not a good fit with you, but I tend to suggest people to you because you're good at finding good fits for people. And that can take out a lot of the work on the front end from, someone having to research different counselors and their qualifications. So how would someone get in touch with you if they want to seek help from someone?
Yeah, they can send me an email. It's Carrie Graham, LPC. So CarrieGraham, LPC @gmail.com.
Well, cool. Well, this has been another episode of the Off Duty On Mission podcast. It was episode 3. Hopefully you got a lot out of it. I said I need all the help I can get. Like, subscribe, follow the channel, send me comments. Anything's appreciated. Thanks for the support so far. So until next time, you guys, be safe, be blessed.